Hello and welcome to the second Lipid Maps podcast. And I'm joined again by Bill Christie, who is the author of Lipid Web, which is a fantastic resource for lipids, biochemistry and lipid mass spec, which is now hosted by Lipid Maps. Bill, how did Lipid Web come about?
It started when I was nearing retirement age in a civil service institute. At that time, we had a relatively low retirement age. I found that I had acquired rather a lot of mass spectrometry data, and I didn't know what to do with this. One of my friends said, "Why don't you set up a website?" That sounded a great idea, but I hadn't a clue about what HTML was. But I bought a book. It turned out to be the first edition of a book which was already into about 7 editions, and with a little help I managed to get it going. So the idea was to just find a way of preserving the mass spectrometry data, which proceeded via what turned out to be a series of tutorials. But one of the first things I had to decide was who was I aiming this at, because I didn't want to aim it at experts in mass spectrometry who would probably turn their nose up perhaps a little at it. And my idea was to be more in tune with young scientists who were new to the topic and needed some basic information. Very much a practical guide as opposed to, say, a mechanistic guide to mass spectrometry. So this was the genesis. Of course, it wasn't called the Lipid Web at that time. It was the Lipid Library, and it went through various names before it ended up, now it was Lipid Maps as part of it, where it's hosted, which I hope will be the last and final iteration of my effort.
Hopefully we can keep this for posterity and it will be there, because it's a great resource, like you say, for new starters looking at the fundamentals of lipid mass spec.
Yes, so I didn't, in fact, retire at that time. I sort of continued. I was rehired immediately by our commercial unit at the Institute, which gave me access to the mass spectrometry facility, and I was able to use that to develop the material for the website quite a bit as well. But once that was well underway, and I began to think, well, what else can I put onto this? I've acquired thousands of references, for example, to analytical methodology over the years. So that went onto the website next as the literature survey. And then I decided one of the things about being retired or semi-retired, we've got plenty of spare time. So the next thing was perhaps what other material have I got that I can put on? And I had written lengthy articles about 10 years previously on triglyceride biochemistry. That was my other research interest. So I adapted that into a web page on triacylglycerols. And having got that going, I began to think, well, what else can go on? I need something to balance triacylglycerol. So I wrote something on phosphatidylcholine. So we had 2 articles, and that was the genesis then of the lipid essentials section.
Which has progressed now, and I'm looking, it's a vast resource on lots of different lipids.
Yes, it started with 2 lipids, and rather than try to sort of integrate chemistry or integrate biochemistry of lipids, I just decided, fairly arbitrarily, to organize it according to lipid classes. And it wasn't really planned in any comprehensive sense at the beginning. It just sort of grew. So having written one article, what else can I do? I've got all this spare time now that I'm retired. And so I began then to think of further lipid classes that I could write about. So it wasn't a sort of planned structure. It just began to emerge, if you like, one article at a time. And if you've got 20 years to play with, it soon adds up to quite a substantial number of articles.
Natural evolution of lipid biochemistry there.
Yes. Again, I was thinking of the same audience. I didn't want to write for experts in the field because it would mean each article would be extremely lengthy and involved and might put off beginners. So my thought was I should aim at young graduates, perhaps, who were starting in research and wanted to know a bit about the chemistry, biochemistry of a particular lipid class. But at the end, I was always giving a list of references, which which would help those who required more information to find it. The other important thing, I think, in relation to these articles and everything on my website is that the writing has been an iterative process. It is never finished because every week I do my weekly literature search on a Saturday morning. I have keywords that I go through the ISI, Web of Science. I get new references. I browse through them, and nowadays it may just be that I decide to add a new reference, and I'll delete an old reference and put in a new one.
So as the field progresses, it's great that the articles are updated.
Yes, this happens daily. For example, already this morning, I've updated the article on hopanoids just by adding a couple of lines, but hopefully it clarifies part of the story on hopanoids. And the same yesterday, it was a couple of lines on phosphatidylglycerol. On the other hand, last week, I started at the beginning and virtually rewrote one of my pieces, which I thought really hadn't had sufficient attention for a while. The mass spectrometry section is now fairly constant and doesn't require too much attention. I browse through it to check that everything's okay from time to time. I occasionally add a reference. I occasionally add new spectra to the archive there with 2,000 spectra, and in the last year I've added another 100.
Yeah, so there is a huge wealth of material there. I think if people want to go to it, it's linked from the homepage at lipidmaps.org. So I think we will both encourage people who are interested in lipids to go there and have a look at what's available.
Yes, so I hope they do. Of course, the other aspect is my blog that, again, it started off with a sort of jokey thing with a little bit of humour in it. In fact, when it was first put to me that it would be a good idea to include this in the Lipid Map, Michael Wakelam said, really enjoy the wit of your blog. And that really worried me because I didn't realise I was being witty. And it meant I now have to be witty every time I write a blog. But it's just things that interest me, hopefully will interest others. It's something that people can check in on every now and again. It doesn't matter if they miss one.
Yes, it's a useful quick review of certain aspects of the field that many of us may otherwise have missed.
And I do get a little bit of feedback from it, usually kind comments, I'm glad to say. But I'm always keen to receive notification of anything that is not as it should be, because it isn't peer-reviewed. Nobody reads what I have written in a formal sense and says this is correct, or even that you're factually wrong here. Thankfully, that doesn't seem to happen very often. But it is useful to get feedback from people to know what they say and to tell me whether perhaps I have strayed too far from what is mainstream thinking on the subject.
So take home message that if you read Bill's blog and see something that you think's wrong, let him know. So thanks, Bill. Thanks very much. That's been a great introduction to the Lipid Web, Lipid Matters, your blog, and Lipid Essentials for the mass spec data. And hope you'll join us next time for our podcast when we chat all things lipids.